Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here. I was extremely fond of Herb. It was one of the great dividends of my life that we got to be good friends. And I know, Jim, that he would be applauding just as generously as all of these people did at the conclusion of your remarks. However, as a journalist sitting back there, I was trying to determine whether they were applauding so generously because of your remarks and your work or the fact that your parents are loyal Republicans. I'm not. Frankly, I'm also compelled to say to you, as I do to my friends Carl Hiaasen and Dave Barry, it's not fair. You get to work in Florida and material shows up every day, all day long. In the course of my journalistic career, some of my very closest friends have been political cartoonists. Paul Conrad in Los Angeles, Mike Peters, the late Jeff McNeely, Oliphant, and the man who started it all for me when I was at a very impressionable young age of 9 or 10, and that was Bill Malden. I memorized up front. It had a huge impact on me, and I think in some small way, Bill Malden led me to write about the greatest generation. I could still look at the upfront collection of series of cartoons and recite from memory all the captions. And so it was, when he passed on, I was particularly touched that his family, I had not met, sent me his Sigma Delta Chi medal, which I keep in a favorite place on my desk. I also keep at home, over my desk, a caricature of me drawn by Herb Bloch. We did a profile on him for Nightly News, and Herb presented this to me at the conclusion of our work together. I've often thought there ought to be a little exercise that you could do. You take one of Herb Bloch's jackhammer cartoons, as Jim so accurately described them, bam, hold it in front of a jury of people who did not know who he was, put him in a lineup of other people, and say, who do you think drew this cartoon? He would be the last one chosen. Because the journalist that we honor here tonight was a gentle man with a big heart. Quiet and fearless courage and an unerring instinct for essential truths. He worked and lived, of course, in the city of big egos and an abundance of self-importance, and yet for all of his fame and power, he never succumbed to those personal temptations. Instead, he harvested those failings in others. He milled them and presented them every morning in a new form. His singular statements in a morning cartoon, a kind of nutritious, high-energy start for the mind and the soul every day for readers of the Washington Post. How many mornings, I often wondered, did big-name reporters and pundits awaken, turn to the Herb Bloch cartoon and say, God, I wished I'd said that. With a few well-directed strokes of his pen, he gave us fresh insights and more than a little humor. Not everyone loved him, of course, and that bothered him not in the slightest. Besides, as one who did, I can only say to those who did not, your loss. He had a long, wonderful run, the most prestigious prizes in journalism, the esteem of his readers and colleagues, and the single most cluttered office in the history of American journalism. It's a shame to say, it's tempting to say it's a shame we don't have him around now, but he might be the first to say, oh, I had a few good days in my time. McCarthyism, Nixon, early and late, Kennedy's, LBJ, Carter, Reagan, Bush 41, Clinton, Watergate, war, Iran-Contra, killer rabbits, Monica, Bush 41 and 43, and so much more. What I think he might say in his own modest, self-deprecating way is, gosh, I think we can do better, don't you? He might have said that at any point during his career because there's always room for improvement. And some of what bedevils us now always has. We have to remind ourselves every day in this city to watch what they do, not just what they say. Whether it is, I'm not a crook, or read my lips, no new taxes, or I did not have sex with that woman, or I want to bring the country together, or will be greeted as liberators, the record is unassailable. Declarations are important, but they have no enduring value unless they're supported by decisions and deeds. It's easier to cover the declarations, the promises, and the explanations, but it is a failure of the compact between journalists and their readers and viewers if the consequences are ignored or underreported. Moreover, in Washington, and I speak as someone who often succumbed to these temptations, there is a false sense of worthiness and bravado in the rituals of the verbal joust that define too much of what passes for aggressive journalism at White House press briefings, congressional hearings, sidewalk news conferences, and on the talk shows. The facts are buried in the public records, the emails, the staffer memos, and the case histories of the office holders, the bureaucrats, and special interest operatives. In most cases, those facts belong to the public, just as surely as the national parks, the highway system, and the very air that we breathe belongs to the public. They seldom emerge unless journalists bring them into the sunlight, and that can be a difficult, even a boring task, but it is what the public should expect of us and all of our inherent and constitutional freedoms. The aggressive and imaginative disclosure of what the public has a right to know and what's being done in its name, often without its permission or approval or knowledge, is not just an obligation of this great profession. It is also a means of constantly renewing the compact with that same public. In this era of voracious appetites for material to fill the 24-hour news channels night and day, radio talk shows, websites, Sunday mornings, I am sympathetic to the challenge, but I also recognize the traps. As an eager consumer of news information, I am determined to know what a journalist has actually learned from the records and the actions taken, not merely what he or she thinks might happen in the future. And dare I say it, if we must turn up the volume for ourselves, shouldn't we also turn up the lamp of self-examination for these journalistic proclamations? We're already well into the election year 2008, and someone ought to be keeping a record of what the reporters and pundits are saying is sure to happen a year from now. I can assure you my favorite theory will hold true as it has every election cycle. I call it the UFO theory. The unforeseen will happen, despite the proclamations of the pundits who claim 2020 vision. Let us now widen our common lens and take in a new universe of American journalism. There was a time not so long ago, at least I think it wasn't so long ago, when darkness came in the early evening and only two planets lit up the skies disseminating news: the Huntley Brinkley Report on NBC and the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. All across this republic, families would gather by appointment to share the evening meal and the experience of first just 15 minutes and then a half hour of news programming. I was part of that audience. An impressionable and ambitious young teenager in the small towns of the Great Plains, my nose pressed up against the glass of this magical view of a world well beyond my rural surroundings. It was, in many ways, a transforming expansion of the universe, occupied not only by working-class families, but millions of others across the television landscape. We were witness in our homes for the first time to events that defined our lives: conventions and elections, scandals and triumphs, disasters and advances, great social causes. The civil rights movement and the anti-war protests were beamed directly into the living rooms of America and shared by families together. Still, for all of their illumination, those two planets that existed in the universe at the time had deep shadows where other forms of life were not nurtured. Racial issues were covered extensively, but gender issues were not. Indeed, very few women had any role in determining, reporting, or commenting on the news. Moreover, in retrospect, the reporting of racial issues, and I was a part of that, was mostly a black and white equation. there was very little reporting of the profound changes within the black culture, positive and negative. The race for space was a marquee event in those early days of broadcast news, but the breathtaking advances in the health sciences were little noticed. Cancer, its origins, prevalence, and treatment was a subject ignored socially and editorially, as we have been witness recently with the difficult circumstances of John and Elizabeth Edwards. America now has a much keener sense of the place of cancer in our lives and how to respond to it. In foreign news, there was a very heavy reliance on Europe, the Middle East, and the Cold War. But in Asia, apart from Vietnam later, little about the extraordinary political and economic evolution of that region, from Japan and Korea to what we used to call Red China. At home, one of the transformational events in popular culture was rarely dealt with on the evening news: rock and roll. In some circles, the NBC News decision to lead the broadcast with the death of Elvis Presley still is considered a heresy. A hinge event representing a break from the secular sacraments of traditional news. The changing role of the young, represented by the most clearly defined generation of the 20th century, the baby boomers, was little noticed outside of the protest context. There was a heavy reliance on Washington hearings, too often without a clear-eyed appraisal of their merit or impact. It was a world reflecting the decisions of the people who made those decisions, most of them white, middle-aged men from a common culture along the eastern seaboard. That was the prism through which we got our news. They were serious professionals of unquestioned integrity and intelligence who understandably reflected the sensibilities of their time and place. They were my role models and mentors. After all, I aspired to their place, and I shared their interests by and large. Think of the difference between then and now. If I were a teenager in South Dakota in the year 2007, I would have access to 4 full-throated networks, 3 full-time cable news channels and local news channels as well, 2 financial news cable channels, a sports network, a history channel, a biography channel, 2 cable channels broadcasting public policy discussions all day, every day. I wake up every morning, thank God, for C-SPAN. I'm the only person in my gym who works out to a discussion on naval policy at the Brookings Institution. We also have a wide-ranging public broadcasting system with its own evening news and an award-winning documentary unit. If I were a teenager back in South Dakota, if I were so inclined, I could watch the BBC News at 10 as well. With a keystroke, I could call up more than 150 websites devoted exclusively to news and information. I could read the New York Times online and the Washington Post before leaving for school, and also check out the box score from my high school team's basketball game in the local paper. So, which universe best serves the public and the place of journalism in a free society? Well, as grateful as I am for all the people who preceded me in this great profession, for their standards, their vision, their commitment to the idea of news, especially those who were the founders of broadcast news, I have to conclude that a new universe is much richer, more accessible, and far-reaching in terms of news, information, and communication. To be sure, it is a universe still in considerable chaos, imperfect in many of its elements. It represents another form of the Big Bang, a vast new universe of enormous potential, which came upon us almost overnight. It demands our attention. Moreover, for all of the ease of access, these choices all make it more challenging for the reader, for the viewer, or the internet surfer to determine what's real and what's not, who can be counted on, and who simply is an extension of Wikipedia, the make-up-your-own-life encyclopedia that is now available on the internet.